I really appreciate it. So let me say hello to everybody. Let me apologize that my video is not working. My computer this morning had some fits and it has now disowned its camera. So I totally apologize for that. So I'm sort of going to be a disembodied voice today. I'm very happy to be here to talk about sage-grouse. I work at Defenders of Wildlife, and I work in a team that works on federal lands specifically, and my portfolio are public lands, the lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management, and also I work on Department of Interior issues. And as you can imagine, sage-grouse has been getting a lot of attention, so it gets a lot of my time. So hopefully today I can give you an overview of what's happening with sage-grouse and its habitats, what we sort of affectionately call the Sagebrush Sea, and the current planning process. So what I wanted to talk to you today about, as I said, was greater sage-grouse, giving you a good overview of the bird, what's happening with its habitats, a little bit of the history of what's led up to what's happening today, which is a revision of the Bureau of Land Management Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation Strategy. We'll focus in a little bit on this thing called areas of critical environmental concern, and then end with a summary of the current process. Oops, snickety here. Sorry about that. So here is this greater sage-grouse. It's an absolutely beautiful bird. If you've had the chance to see it, especially in when it's doing its lekking, its mating dances, it's astounding. The greater sage-grouse prefer large expanses of healthy and minimally disturbed sagebrush steppe ecosystems, where they can find in close proximity their mating areas, brood rearing areas, and overwintering habitats. So in the early spring, the males congregate in what we call leks, which are visible bald areas. You can see one in the top right photograph, where they dance and strut in the early morning to attract females. The females nest within several miles of the leks center. The females are looking for places where they can have sagebrush and good forb grass populations. They want to build their nests under the cover of the sagebrush and hidden by the grass and the forbs, and then they're looking for the nutrition in the native forbs and in the spring with the insects that are around all those vegetations. Once the chicks reach a certain size and the uplands begin to dry out, the brood works its way towards wetter places on the landscape in search of insects that can provide the necessary nutrition for those chicks to grow up. So key things to know, the leks are very important. The males have high fidelity to those leks. They're not too flexible about moving and finding different lekking areas. And then within a certain, essentially a buffer zone around those leks is where we find most of the sage-grouse. That's where the females nest and where they raise their broods. And so when we look at greater sage-grouse populations, it's been a species of concern for quite a while, many decades. We've seen there's been some really good population work done by the USGS that has shown that we've had about an 80% decline since the 1960s, and that's an accelerating decline, so 41% in the last 2 decades. 87% of the range now has declining populations since 2002. So I can show you in this next slide that illustrates that point. So we're looking at the average annual rate of change in greater sage-grouse since 2002. And all the areas that are not blue are in decline. And of course, the sort of the brighter the red, the more in decline it is. So the sage-grouse live in what we call the Sagebrush Sea, these beautiful big expanses of sagebrush steppe habitats that we see across the interior West. Here's a map that delineates the external boundary of this biome. The green areas show the sagebrush ecosystems within this broader extent of the biome, and the darker green areas show the sagebrush ecosystems that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. BLM, as we call the Bureau of Land Management, administers about 43% of the sagebrush ecosystems within the biome. So what BLM does really influences the future of the sage-grouse. And not only the sage-grouse live within the sagebrush steppe ecosystems or the sagebrush biome, but lots of other species, many of whom are listed as species of conservation concern. So I can point out in the top left is the pygmy rabbit. It's the tiny little rabbit. It can fit in the palm of your hand. It's also a sagebrush obligate, like the greater sage-grouse, and it was petitioned for listing by defenders and a few other organizations last year and just went through the 90-day finding process. The Sagebrush Sea, a lot goes on in the Sagebrush Sea. It incorporates towns and communities and agriculture and energy development, all sorts of stuff. Because of that, it's about 50% of what the extent of the Sagebrush Sea is about 50% of what it was historically. And with recent work by the USGS, they've calculated that in recent years, we've lost about 1.3 million acres per year. So it's rare now when you drive across the Sagebrush Sea to see really long, expansive, uninterrupted extents of fairly native natural sagebrush habitats. With all these uses, one of the things we're seeing is invasions, especially by annual exotic grasses like cheatgrass. The maps here show that if you look on the left map, you can see that the beige areas are the Bureau of Land Management lands, and the green areas are where invasive grasses are now considered dominant. So you can look in 1992 on the left and 2022 on the right, and you can see how much that has changed. The current estimates based off BLM monitoring plots are that about 15% of lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management today are dominated by invasives. To me, that's a super startling statistic. As we all know, it is incredibly hard to reverse ecosystems that have been invaded and to restore them back to their natural vegetation. And with 15%, even if we keep expanding at the rate we're going, we're going to have more and more acres every year on an accelerating rate getting taken over by invasives. We also see that other environmental forces are acting on the Sagebrush Sea. We are really seeing manifestation of climate change. On the left is a drought map that shows counties that have experienced multiple years of drought over the last 5 years. And as you can see, and I'm sure you would know that in the southern part of the habitats, we're seeing more extreme effects, but we're seeing drought effects across the biome. Excuse me. And between the invasive grasses that facilitate fire and the warming and drying of a good deal of the habitat, we're seeing more fires and more acres burnt every year. Sagebrush ecosystems are quite slow to regenerate after fires. Sagebrush are a slow-growing species, and especially in the face of invasive grasses that are very good at establishing after fire. So let's talk a little bit about the conservation timeline of the greater sage-grouse. As I said when I started, the sage-grouse has been on the radar of biologists and conservationists for a number of decades. It was first petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act in 1999. It's gone through a long history of listing, going to courts and coming back. In 2004, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a not warranted finding that was challenged. The court overturned it in 2007, and that catalyzed a lot of research and science around the condition of sage-grouse and its habitats. Using that science in 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found listing the species was warranted, but precluded, which essentially means, yes, it's on an extinction trajectory, but we have higher priorities. One of the issues that Fish and Wildlife Service particularly called out, it was the lack of regulatory certainty from the existing management plans of the federal agencies that manage a good deal of the sage-grouse's habitat. So that catalyzed a large, unprecedentedly large planning process with federal agencies and state agencies working together and other parties to essentially develop a conservation strategy that was then embodied in about 100 plan amendments across the Western United States, about 70 or so BLM land use plan amendments, and the others on other agencies. With all of that done, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came back in 2015 and said, we're now finding the species not warranted for listing because there is regulatory certainty through these land use management plans. Whoops. But then our administration's changed, and in 2019, the Trump administration amended those land use management plans, and they weakened the provisions in the 2015 plans and reduced some of that regulatory certainty. And now, in response, as the administration shifted again, in 2022, the Biden administration initiated a third round of land use plan amendments to address the situation with the greater sage-grouse. So I'm going to give you a bit of a summary of what those 2015 greater sage-grouse plans did. The general concept was to delineate management zones across the entire range. So they delineated priority habitats and general habitats. The priority habitats on this map are the darker purple. And the idea was in this priority habitats, which were deemed essential for continued sage-grouse viability, they would limit disturbance through an avoid, minimize, and mitigate strategy. So avoid disturbances where you absolutely can't avoid them, you minimize. If you absolutely can't minimize impacts, you go to mitigation. They established what they called sagebrush focal areas, 10 million acres, and they recommended a mineral withdrawal for those acres. So those acres are in the green hatching. They also focused in on lekking zones. As I said when I started this talk, that the sage-grouse have high fidelity to their leks, and then most of the sage-grouse and most of the high-quality habitat are found in a circular zone going out from those leks. So the plans recognize that biological need, and limited disturbance, in particular in those what we'll just call lecking zones. And going back to the mitigation, where disturbance absolutely couldn't be avoided, the plans said you'll do mitigation with net conservation gain. So we're headed into the third round of Greater Sage-grouse planning. We're 9 years after those 2015 plans went into effect. Oh, and I should add, the Trump plans, the 2019 Trump amendments that did weaken the 2015 plans were enjoined by a court. So Bureau of Land Management and the other agencies are managing the Greater Sage-grouse under the 2015 framework. So as we go into this new round of planning a decade later, it's really important to ask, are the 2015 plans working? And I've already talked about the populations. We know that they're continuing to decline. Sometimes it can be hard to see the effects of management changes in this short time period, but what we can do on populations, but what we can do is look at the condition of the habitats and where the land management agencies particularly have discretion to allow disturbances or not. So when the third round of planning started in 2022, defenders asked that question, well, how are the habitats doing? And in particular, we asked, how are the priority habitats doing? Because these were the places that the Bureau of Land Management said, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service together said, these are the most important places for the sage-grouse on the landscape. And in fact, these are the places that we think are essential to their long-term viability. So the map here shows the priority habitats across the landscape. The first question, or the first inquiry we went on, is said, what is the land health condition of the priority habitats using BLM's land health evaluation data? So the BLM every 10 years is supposed to go and evaluate grazing allotments, which is most of these places are grazed, so they're within grazing allotments. And they're supposed to do a land health assessment, evaluation, and determination. And they have a bunch of standards that they're supposed to evaluate, and are the particular places they're evaluating meeting those land health standards or working towards those land health standards. And so the purple places on this landscape are on this map are showing the BLM lands that are not achieving land health standards per their last evaluation. The lighter pink areas are the places that have never been evaluated for land health. So 47% of the priority habitats are not achieving or even working towards achieving. And 24% have never been evaluated. So that's about 3/4 of the priority habitats either are not meeting or we just don't know what the condition is. And then we looked at, well, BLM as the agency here, are they authorizing uses of the land that are problematic for the greater sage-grouse? So if we focus in on the state of Wyoming here, we can see that, yes, since 2015, BLM has authorized rights of way for transmission, pipelines, et cetera. They have put up for sale and sold oil and gas leases. That's in the blue. And the rights of way are in the red. So Wyoming is a big energy state, and we've seen 17% of the priority habitats in this time period committed to energy development. Energy is a big threat to the greater sage-grouse in the eastern portion of the range. And in the western portion of the range, like the Grace Basin area, we're looking a lot more grazing, invasives, and fire. So question is the 2015 framework still strong and we just need to tweak it as we go into these new plan amendments, or do we need a new approach? And so I just excerpted a few quotes from various studies or articles here to give you a sense. Top left, this is from a USGS paper. where the author said small incremental changes to the existing amount of conservation delivery and coordination will likely not abate the expected loss in sagebrush ecological integrity and consequently the loss of sagebrush obligates like the greater sage-grouse. Top right was the 2022 State of the Birds report. Greater sage-grouse shows a continued steep decline that warrants increased voluntary habitat conservation incentives and renewed strong and state protections. So you can get the gist that people are sort of ringing the alarm bell and saying it's still not working. We need to do something, and maybe tweaking around the edges is not what we need. So let's talk about the current planning process in a little more detail. So on March 15th, this year, BLM published draft sage-grouse plan amendments and environmental impact statements. The way they structure the environmental impact statements is they have a preferred alternative. So that lists the plan amendment that they are proposing to put into place. And then they offer a series of other amendments alternatives for comparison. So in this case, we have one preferred alternative and we have 5 other alternatives for comparison. The preferred alternative, if you're looking at this, is alternative 5. And then BLM actually offered 2 comment opportunities. One's coming right up next week, May 14th, on this thing called Areas of Critical Environmental Concern, which I'll talk about more in a sec. And then June 13th on all other components of the plans. BLM has said that it's fine to comment on areas of critical environmental concern even through June 13th, if you just want to combine all the comments into one comment letter. So areas of critical environmental concern it's a statutory designation. It's BLM's primary way to make conservation designations in land use plans. The statutory definition of these areas of critical environmental concern, you'll hear them called ACECs, are areas within the public lands where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historical, cultural, or scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, or other natural systems or processes. We're going to circle back to ACECs in a moment, but let's zone out a little bit, bigger picture. So what do the sage-grouse proposed plans do? So this alternative 5, the preferred alternative. So unfortunately, what we're seeing, I'm still digging in, it's a big document, but what I do see is weakened protections around the leks. So again, bringing us back to the biology of the bird, most of the sage-grouse and most of the quality habitat is at these lekking zones, these circular zones around the lek centers. And when I say zones, we're not talking 200 feet. The science shows that within 4 or 5 miles is where most of the birds and the quality habitat is. So when we're talking about protecting around the leks, we're really looking at 5-mile diameter circles. It opens the priority habitats to oil and gas leasing. So I showed you that map of Wyoming before. Wyoming was the only state. Wyoming had a slightly different allowances under the 2015 plan. In this proposed plan, they're opening priority habitats in the other states across the range to oil and gas leasing. They do have protections with that, where they say we're going to prioritize no surface occupancy, et cetera, but they're still going to be open. Mixed priority habitats avoidance areas for renewable energy. In 2015, they were exclusion areas. Reduces the objective of mitigation from a net gain to no net loss, and it relies on state mitigation programs for that. So that's actually really important, I think. A net gain standard really incentivizes everyone to find ways to avoid disturbing the habitat. When you have a no net loss standard, that incentive diminishes quite a bit. It removes the sagebrush focal areas. If you remember, that was the 10 million acres in green hatching on the previous map. It removes that concept completely, and it discards the concept of withdrawing certain acres within the habitat from hard rock mining. And it doesn't designate areas of critical environmental concern. So not designating these ACECs hits particularly hard for me and defenders of wildlife, because defenders actually nominated in a network. We called it the Sagebrush Sea Reserve ACEC network. It's the dark green lands on this map. We nominated it for consideration in this planning process. Our network primarily captured the priority habitats with some changes. We excised places that had been too damaged by energy development. And then we added some higher elevation lands that we thought would turn into better sage-grouse habitat and should be prioritized with climate change. BLM did include ACECs within those other alternatives, not within the preferred alternative, alternative 5, but they did include it in 2 other alternatives, alternatives 3 and 6. And I can see I have a typo here. That should be 3 and 6 on this slide. So BLM identified the places that are served in that orangey yellow color. It's about 11 million acres, and said, we're going to analyze what the consequences would be of designating these areas of critical environmental concern, but we're not doing it in our preferred alternative. So clearly defenders of wildlife thought there were good reasons to push to have an ACEC network for the greater sage-grouse. I think in part we found that the 2015 paradigm of avoid, minimize, and mitigate isn't providing the strong enough protections to the lands that are deemed essential for the sage-grouse's long-term viability. And that what we need is to say, no, we're just going to protect the really critical lands and then apply avoid, minimize, mitigate on the general habitats, which are still occupied by sage-grouse, but are essentially less important for their continued viability. ACECs bring attention to the area, they bring funding, they bring resources, and in general, they're just regarded more as these are places where we're going to really think about conservation. And where we were responding to the experts who were saying, we can't just tweak around the edges, we need a different paradigm. And so we thought and expressed through our nomination that a new paradigm, an appropriate one, would be to have a network of these ACECs range-wide. So I think in summary, the BLM preferred alternative in this 3rd round of land use plan amendments is that it actually weakens the protections that were offered in the 2015 plans, even though there isn't really evidence to suggest that the 2015 plans are sufficient to curb the long-term population declines. I would encourage people to write comments. I've put some resources here. Defenders of Wildlife have put up a Sage-Grouse Action Center page. We have a story map that goes into more detail about changes that are occurring across the Sagebrush Sea to the greater sage-grouse habitats and other wildlife habitats. We have fact sheets for each state that are specific to greater sage-grouse and really focus in on what's happening to the priority habitats in each state, looking at a series of metrics. And we also provide a link to our ACEC nomination. And I also would direct people to the BLM Sage-Grouse Planning website. There's actually a lot of resources on there. And then you can get links to the plans in case you want to dive in. And Defenders of Wildlife is putting out action alerts. So if you want to have assistance on what to write for comments, it's great to sign up for our alerts. And then in summary, I would say greater sage-grouse, it's a remarkable species that spanned much of the northern part of North America. And we are in a position to curb these declines, but it's going to take more than the planning frameworks that were being offered since 2015 and continuing today. And that we do need this paradigm shift. We need to provide stronger protections to these key habitats. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Shami, go ahead.
Yeah, great job, Vera. That was so helpful. Really walking us through the history and the need for these, particularly these ACECs. I guess I remain hopeful as maybe defenders, as a defender, that the other alternatives that include the ACECs will be really, that comments will be so thoughtful that BLM will maybe bring that into their preferred alternative. But I guess that remains to be seen. My question for you, however, is with the BLM's new rule for conservation leasing, does that have any benefits for sage-grouse recovery or protection of these leks?
Yeah, I'm actually going to let me respond to your first comment about ACECs, and then I can talk about the BLM rule. This comment period is the opportunity where people can really step up, and if you think that the ACEC approach might be appropriate, you can definitely comment and say I want ACECs. BLM has offered 11 million acres. Our proposal was actually 48 million acres, but either way, I think obviously we'd like to see the bigger range wide because we think it's more focused on the biological needs and that we need broader protections. But I would very much encourage people to submit comments and promote the concept of the ACCs. In terms of the BLM rule, for those who may know, the Bureau of Land Management just promulgated a final rule. It's called the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. And it is essentially providing BLM a series of tools for essentially bringing conservation to an equal footing with all the other activities that it manages, like energy and grazing and logging, et cetera. And so that rule has a number of key aspects that could very much help if it gets implemented well. It brings that rule, creates this concept called intact landscapes, where in planning processes, BLM needs to go identify intact landscapes, which are basically not that disturbed places, and then consider them in the planning process. It broadens out that concept of land health standards and strengthens that up. It has a much bigger focus on restoration of landscapes. And in one of the elements that you raised, Shami, is that it creates this concept of a restoration lease. So a government agency, a tribe, an NGO can come in and apply for a restoration lease in particular places, and then essentially signs this lease contract with the BLM to do work over the course of 10 years to help restore natural habitats. So I do feel like there's definitely tools there now that the BLM has put out in this rule. They're not mandatory necessarily, but there are tools that are available. And I think if the agency uses them well and stakeholders also avail themselves, we could advance the restoration and recovery of the species.
Thank you, Vera.
Thanks.
Hi, Vera. Great talk. It's Henry from Split. Very interesting talk. I didn't know much about sage-grouse, and I learned a lot. I'm just curious from like an ecological perspective, in terms of their habitat needs. Obviously the macro habitat, having large intact, chunks of the sagebrush is important. are there particular microhabitat needs that they have for breeding or for other aspects of their life history? And kind of as an ancillary question, is there a certain amount of, you know, invasion where there's like a threshold where if there's like a certain amount of grass in a sagebrush system, like cheatgrass, for example, or another invasive species, does it make the habitat unsuitable for them? I'm just curious to know what specific aspects of the microhabitat might influence their occupancy.
Yeah, so let me try to make sure I answer all those parts of that question. So yes, so they need, when we're looking at different scales, at the large scale, they need these connected sagebrush habitats
Sure.
because we need that genetic interchange at that larger scale. When we zone in for lekking, they, as I said, they have high fidelity leks. There is some flexibility there, I think, the biologists see, but for the most part, they want to go back to these same historic lekking areas. And then the reason the leks are there is it's because
Yes.
there's good habitat around there for the females to good nesting and brood rearing habitat within a certain distance. And so it all works out. And so that's how those historic leks have sort of become established. So
The second part was about the
yeah,
cheatgrass. Is there a
yeah,
level of invasion that like precludes sagegrass
yeah.
from being
I'm
established?
actually gonna, yeah, I'll get there. I'll actually go back one more comment on the biology. So really important that the sage-grouse need these mesic areas for brood rearing. So they can go in the uplands and they can have their nests. If there's good forbs, the research is showing that the perennial forbs are really key on the uplands when they're nesting and that they have their broods. And then absolutely key is as the chicks are getting older, they need to find mesic areas, you know, relatively nearby, right? Where they can take their chicks and they can get the forbs and the insects that they need at
Got it.
those places. And so you can have really good sage-grouse habitat, but if you don't have the wetter areas, they're not going to be there.
Gotcha.
And so how you manage the uplands in particular is really important. So if you have a lot of overgrazing, for instance, and erosion, and you're not holding the water on the landscape, and so your creeks are getting incised, et cetera, then you will not have those mesic areas sustaining over time. So it really goes, you have to look holistically at how you manage the landscape, and you can't just focus in on putting a protective zone around this one little wet area. You really have to keep the water on the hillside and in the landscape.
Gotcha.
In terms of thresholds, I think there is a ton of research going on to figure out these thresholds. There's been a lot of focus on pinyon juniper forests, and pinyon juniper trees sort of on the leading edge sometimes will poke up in the sagebrush habitat, very natural condition and needed by birds like the pinyon jay. And so a lot of sage-grouse habitat work has focused on cutting down those trees. And it's
Gotcha.
becoming increasingly controversial. They have found that at about 4% canopy of pinyon juniper trees within the sagebrush is when you start seeing the sage-grouse decline.
Gotcha.
So in that similar light, I think they're looking at other habitat factors and what those thresholds are. There was a lot of focus put initially on pinyon juniper because I think it was a very easy thing, like the tree's there, let's cut it down. And but I think now they're realizing, wait, that's not we have to be more thoughtful about how we do this.
Gotcha.
So in terms of the invasive species, I don't know what that threshold is, but it definitely gets to a place where you're losing the perennials and the fire, and then you're introducing this threat of fire that wasn't naturally there. I think grazing's affected the fire regime as well. So we have all these interacting historic uses of the sagebrush steppe that are all sort of cumulatively affecting what it looks like and behaves today.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Were there any other questions for Vera?
I had one more question if no one else is
Sure.
going to ask. Sorry to bombard you, Vera. I'm just curious. So you mentioned energy and the impacts that the energy has in the landscape. Is the main impacts, is it habitat degradation? Is it just straight up habitat loss, like they're just chopping down the sagebrush? And then the follow-up question to that is how long, you know, would it take to recover in the absence of active restoration? I'm just curious because I work in grassland systems and there are some similarities, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
So there is some research. BLM in the 2015 plan sort of set a 3% disturbance cap, and they set some energy development density caps as well. So they were sort of hanging on some early research that sort of pointed at some of that. Right now, the BLM, you know, how you calculate disturbance, the devil's sort of in the detail. So BLM's calculating across a lot of its units. These are pretty large units, 1% or less disturbance, yet we're still seeing considerable declines. So there's a lot of room to explore where the problems might be. Maybe the caps are too high, maybe the way they calculate it is wrong, maybe the scales they're looking at aren't right, etc. So some of that conversation's going on. So that's like another threshold that we're discussing. In terms of energy development, so a couple of issues. Whenever you provide perching habitat, so that's why the pinyon juniper trees or ponderosas or whatever you have nearby, if you have power lines, if you have energy infrastructure, raptors can, and corvids, you know, they want to perch, and then it gives them a view of, so they can predate more easily.
Gotcha.
And so that's a lot of why energy is a problem. But then you also just get to a disturbance level that sage-grouse are really sensitive to disturbance and noise. And it just gets to a level where they just discard the area. So the kinds of densities that we're seeing in Wyoming are not supporting sage-grouse. In terms of recovering that, you know, sagebrush steppe is notoriously difficult to recover. And so once we've disturbed it, I don't think we can count on going back and saying, we'll just pick back those acres back up.
Right. It's kind of like an alternative stable state that's really hard to reverse, so to speak.
If cheatgrass gets in there, for sure. And then just generally, even if you are on the path to recovering native sage-grouse, what you usually get is more of like a native grassland, and then the sagebrush come in, but they're extremely slow growing and it might take 50 years to get the maturity of a sagebrush necessary to provide that habitat. So when we have fires or disturbances, you really can't count on that habitat in the period of time that we need to support this bird.
Yeah, totally. Makes sense.
I have just two comments. I live in southeastern Alberta. I'm not a scientist, but I've got a science background and been following the sage-grouse with our local naturalist group since the mid-90s. And I can't help but notice the parallels in the lack of concern by the wildlife agencies. It's so similar. Ours are in danger of extirpation here. And you just mentioned the man-made structures for the perching of the raptors, and so fence posts and the pumping houses for the gas lines and things, but you just mentioned that. Just wanted to mention these. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I do think we see it across the entire range, and the range, you know, this is a very US centric talk. My apologies to the Canadians. But certainly the greater sage-grouse range extends north into Canada. And I do think the issues are quite similar. Yeah.
Great. One last call for questions. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Vera, for sharing your time and expertise with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Again, there's a link in the chat for the next Prairie webinar that is now, I've got all the confirmation information fixed. It's all correct. It's May 28th, and it's with Alejandro Espinoza Trevino. on bison conservation at the El Carmen Nature Reserve in Mexico. Yeah, thank you so much. And this was recorded, so if you have friends and things like that who missed it, that's okay. I'll put it up on the website probably early next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Vera. Appreciate you. Thank you, Lindsay. Henry,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody. Good to see you.
Thanks, Vera.
Bye.
Nice job, Vera. Very cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.